Welcome everyone. This is the Pittsburgh WordPress Mega Meetup. Thank you for joining us. We usually have the Pittsburgh WordPress Meetup group usually has a meetup once a month, and we try to find speakers from all around the area or outside the area to share something that they know about WordPress. So if you're somebody who is interested in WordPress and has a topic that has not yet been discussed, please feel free to reach out to us and tell us what that topic is. Or if you have a desire to speak about something WordPress, we would also be interested in hearing what you would have to say. So thanks for joining us. Today we have Mike Hale, who's going to talk about the future of headless WordPress with JAMstack. And Mike Hale is the founder of Stomp Gear Digital Marketing, a web developer at Black Doctor, and a realtor, and also has many other interests and talents. So at this point, I'm going to hand the reins over to Mike and let him begin.
All right. Thank you very much, Miranda. Let me get my screen going here. Okay, I'm just going to share my slides here. Can everybody see that okay? Just nods. Okay, good. I'm always nervous when I'm doing a Zoom one, the technology. I'm a developer, but I'm not very good with technology. So let me just get myself set up here. All right. So like Miranda said, I'm Mike Hale. I do run my own digital marketing agency. It's a mix of doing content strategy, digital marketing, and a lot of that is website design. One of the things I didn't do when I started was I didn't want to be like, another WordPress shop. So I kind of like that marketing side of things, but I do a lot of WordPress websites. I also do a lot of custom plugin development for other agencies. Usually when they have one-off client project that they need some help with, or they're just swamped, I do a lot of freelance development stuff as well. And I'm also part of the SiteGround Brand Ambassador Program. They help support some of the WordPress community getting out to meetups. If this was an actual event, they would help me get out to that. So, proud to be a part of that. I've been doing web development for 20 plus years in one form or another. I started very early on the web. And this talk is about, I got into WordPress, I should add, I got into WordPress about 2011 or so. I was doing a lot of .NET corporate development jobs before that. And I got into WordPress about 2011, so that's where the balance shifted to doing almost exclusively WordPress development. So I've been doing it for a while, really enjoy it, I love the community, love the platform itself, the flexibility, being able to extend it as needed. But this talk is really going to be about kind of the future of WordPress because things are changing. WordPress has 30-some% of the web, depending on what surveys and polls you look at, and it's growing super fast. Can it grow that much? No. How is it going to be used differently in the in the future? But before we jump into the future, we have to take a trip to the past. Now, I don't know if anybody watched Dark on Netflix, but this is the time travel cave. I know it's an obscure joke, but I had to put it in there. We're gonna go back to when I started, which was kind of the mid to late 90s. And these were the days of the browser wars. Table layouts was a huge thing. This is even before JavaScript and CSS were really a thing, not such a huge percentage of what they are now. In fact, this was before PHP was really a thing, which is what WordPress is built on. This is when when websites basically look like this, the classic 90s website, and I built so many of these, it was ridiculous. All the content was static HTML files, just text files with markup. You edited these pages in things like hot metal and sausage and all these weird freeware HTML editors that came out. This is before Dreamweaver and Front Page even. So that was those were groundbreaking things. When Dreamweaver came out, that was a great tool, but the interaction of these pages was very limited. Like I said before, JavaScript was not a powerful language. It was not really widely adopted. It did very little things on the page. It was usually just manipulating things and moving them around. Most interaction was just forms based. Submit a form, get a result. maybe put it in a database somewhere. In the early days, this was written mostly in things like Perl, which is probably the most, unpleasant language to work with. I'll put it like that. In fact, a lot of the things in PHP kind of came out of that, as far as like, the scalar variables, always like the $ prefix. Some of the things kind of came out of Perl. And the worst part about this is all the pages, you built most of these by hand. There was very little in the way of WYSIWYG editors at the time. And the main problem with something like this is if you wanted to change anything on your page, if you wanted to add something to that big mega menu on the left, you had to go in and change it on every page because that menu would be on every page. If you changed the logo, you'd have to change it on every page. And there were some ways it kind of started getting smarter about that you could do those things, but it was a lot of work. Tools like Dreamweaver, when they came along, they really simplified some of that, and then there were ways you could include it. But it was a lot of work to make a simple change. Very limited styling, minimal HTML, and they had to be because this was high-speed internet, the 56K modem. So that was groundbreaking. Pages were well crafted, they were fast, and then things got better. CSS came out and really, the like CSS 2 and 3 now, and it really gave you a lot more things that you could do. JavaScript, the language itself, became much more powerful. A lot of new features into it. A lot of different ways that you could interact with the web page. Flash came out at around that point. And if anybody remembers Flash, it was a way with a lot of animations. There were entire websites built in Flash. Super cool. A lot of issues. SEO wasn't great for Flash websites. You had to learn this different language to work with Flash, and it was good for like different animations and interactive stuff that you couldn't get with HTML and even JavaScript at the time. But the problem is they were larger files that had to be downloaded, and there was a thing called ActiveX components that Microsoft put out, which I built a few of. So the web started becoming much more interactive. Around this time, things like PHP was gaining popularity. Microsoft released active server pages, which became .NET, that was what I actually started with, and those combinations let us build things like e-commerce sites and web applications, and moving things to the web. What used to just basically be called like brochureware. It was just those basic 5-page websites that you took from your marketing flyers and and just shoveled them onto the web as is. It really became a lot more interactive. The problem with this is this was still in the days of low speed internet. You might have had an ISDN line, or DSL was just starting, and the very, very first cable modems were coming out. So all of these interactivity and Flash and Active, all of these things came at a price because they were more expensive to download. So we got cost of speed, but at the cost of, or flexibility, but at the cost of performance. And again, you still had the issue of having to edit everything kind of by hand and uploading all these files. So that kind of led to the birth of the content management system. And this isn't a new idea. This didn't start with WordPress. When I was building ASP websites, there would be an admin side where you could add content for a web page, and that's a content management system. If you think about it, all it boils down to is it's an app that lets you create and manage the content for your website. And content could be blog posts, images, documents. You might have a lot of PDFs, assets, downloadable files, whatever it may be. The CMS just lets you manage those things in an admin side, so that you're not going back to this page. And every time you add a downloadable file for your business, you don't have to go back on your downloads page and add the link manually. You'll add it on the admin side, and it'll show up. It's a UI that lets you manage the content. So there's a lot of tools, with the different editors, setting the different options. It's going to have a database to store the content, some language that will then display it to the users on the front end. And while this makes managing content much easier, it comes at the cost of speed and performance again, because now this is an application. It's not just that static website that is out there sitting on the web. That's just a file that you download. every time you go to get to a WordPress webpage, even just a blog post, that web server has to load the PHP that makes all of the calls into the database. And it's not just like saying, give me the content of this database, or give me the content for this post from the database. It's getting the content. It's checking all the hooks, all the actions, all the theme actions. Every plugin is getting loaded and run. So it's doing a lot of different things. If you're a developer and you're ever curious about that, put Query Analyzer or the WP debug bar on your page, and you'll see just how many things it makes. I think I counted once, it was 11 billion requests. Might be exaggerating a little bit on that, but it's a lot. And then all that HTML has to get bundled up, sent back to the browser. The browser then has to load the HTML. Remember, it's going to load the CSS, it's going to load the JavaScript. The JavaScript is going to manipulate the DOM and move things around. The CSS styles that have to get applied. So this is an expensive process that we've built. The page, the average page size could be a couple megabytes, and then you have third-party scripts coming in and images and all this. So it's really an expensive process. And yes, there are some things in WordPress that will help mitigate some of that. Caching is a big thing. And what caching does is basically on the admin side or on the server side, it generates a static HTML file of your WordPress pages. And then when you request that, you're requesting that page. And it helps, but it doesn't apply in every situation. It's no static site, and I'll talk about this later on the performance side of JAMstack sites, is you still are going to have the browser load time and everything, but it does help. So if you have the point of the big difference between the CMS, the interactive CMS, and a static site is that it has to hit the database. It has to run all of that PHP logic. It has to run all the hooks, all the filters, do everything that they said. Load every plugin that's active. Check if it has to do anything. The theme's going to load. The theme's going to do all of its stuff, generate the page and output it. And then the browser does its whole job. So it would be nice if there was a way that we could have all of that admin flexibility, all of the things that it lets us do on the admin side to manage our content, but not have that, not have all of that interaction on the server side. Just load static HTML files without having hit the database, without having hit the PHP and everything. So my idol, Mr. Willy Wonka, said, you've got to go forwards to go back. Better press on. So we can. We don't have to go back to the dark ages of the web, the 90s, where we had, you don't have CMS systems and everything's static, but we can use some of the new tools to generate all of those static files for us. So we're not doing it by hand. We're getting the benefits of it, but we're still leveraging the WordPress admin, the editor flow, the being able to create the content with Gutenberg blocks and all of those benefits that it gives us. And there's a couple different models of doing this, a couple different ways of doing this. And these are some concepts, and these are terms that I use. They're generally accepted, but there are no real hard and fast definitions about the different models of websites that we have today. But the first is coupled. This is WordPress. So you have one app. It's also, some people also call this a monolithic app. It's one thing. The front end, the back end, everything is one application. It just protects people from the front end going to the admin, and then the admin side is what gets put on the front end. All of the content of the website is managed on the back end. It's stored in the database. That's where the database lives. The content is pulled from the back end, spits out a front end interface, and WordPress case, that's the theme. And so really the back end and the front end are two sides of a single application. And this is fine, but it's the user interface, all your business logic, your database interface, your database itself, all in one application. So that's how WordPress works now. It's a coupled system. Everything's under one roof, and the benefits of that is it's one piece of code to maintain. The one problem with this is that everything that you do is going to be, if you mess up something on the back end, your front end's not going to work. If you have a theme that has an error, and or if you have a plugin that has an error on the back end, and your site goes down, your front end is down until you can get that fixed. this kind of brings us to the decoupled model. This is you see a lot of these. If you think about the apps on your phone, most of these are decoupled. The app on your phone is going to be the front end, the UI of the application, and then it's going to make all API calls, and the database is stored somewhere else. You're not storing all the data on your phone, for these applications. Yeah, a lot of the apps will keep a copy of them, but a lot of times this is interacting with the backend that's somewhere else. The other example of this is if you have like a JavaScript application that's just calling different APIs and building, and that's what kind of the JAMstack model is, which we'll get into. But in this model, the back end and the front end, they're managed separately. They're two different applications that talk to each other. The database, and back end systems could be on one server. The front end could live somewhere completely different. That's the other thing with the coupled models. Everything sits on one server. So if you have a high traffic site, that front end is going to be taxing that server. The admin, if you have a long running processor, if you have something intensive that it's doing, that's going to be taxing the server. It's going to be affecting the front end. On a decoupled model, you don't have those things. Everything is separate, and they're going to talk to each other through some sort of API. The front end is going to connect to the back end application, get the data that it needs to display. It's going to make calls that will do the business logic and bring it back to the front end. How much logic you have on the front end versus the back end just is going to vary by the application. In general, it's better to keep your front end a little simpler, unless if you're having to make a lot of calls, and there's things that you can push to the front end. There's no hard line or hard and fast rules or guidelines of how to do that. It's really just going to go on an app by app basis. The limitation with a decoupled model is that the front end UI and the admin side, the back end side, they have to be connected at all times. If your back end application goes down for whatever reason, they're on a different server, that server goes down, your front end app will not work because it's not able to connect to the data. And you'll see that in your, again, I use the example of the apps on your phone. Sometimes you'll be doing something, it'll say, can't connect to server for what, your thing's down. That's the same thing. Now, you might not think of WordPress as being decoupled, because when you talk about the coupled ones, everything's all in one. Technically, WordPress is a decoupled CMS as well. This came with, it didn't come with the REST API. There was a function in WordPress, the XML RPC, which was a very, very scary, unpleasant way to pull data out of it using these XML RPC commands, which was a very older technology. And then a couple of years ago, I believe it was Ryan McHugh, kind of as a summer of code experiment, started building a REST API for WordPress, and it took off. And there's a lot of contributors, and a lot of people have helped. And this has become quite a powerful feature that started out as a plugin for WordPress, and then got baked right into core WordPress. So WordPress now comes with a pretty full-featured REST API. There are some things in there that don't quite work like you'd want them to. Authentication is an issue. There's not a great way to, using like, OAuth authentication gets a little tricky. It uses, like your username. So there are some things around that. But if you're just pulling public data, which you could pull basically from the RSS feed now, that is fine. So really, with the introduction of REST API, WordPress became capable of being used as a decoupled system, because you can build an app that just pulls that in. And if you look at something like, Automatic came out with Calypso, which is kind of their admin system for WordPress.com. That is a good example of a decoupled. That's actually decoupled from the admin side. So that's kind of in three ways. You could have the admin app that just connects to the database and gets your data and manages it there, where you still have WordPress, and then you have the front end separately. Like, imagine just picking up your theme and making it a standalone piece that doesn't have all the rest of the code from WordPress and putting it on a different server. And now we come to headless. So a headless CMS is one that doesn't have a presentation layer. It doesn't have the front end. It's very much like decoupled, but it's more or less just for managing the content. And again, headless is kind of a vague term. it could mean a lot of different things get kind of lumped into that headless CMS one. But if you think about it, think of it as just a content API or an app that you manage content, but there are no themes. There's no output of the front end stuff. You have to connect to this to get the data for that. You have to have a separate application. And the benefit of this is they can be more powerful. These companies are focused on building that headless CMS on its own. It's like the decoupled, but there are instances where you may not need to have the headless site up and running at all times. The API doesn't need to be available every time for that app, because if you're using the JAMstack, your site gets built when new content is created, or maybe on a nightly basis or something. So there's things you can do, and I'll bring this up in a little more detail when we talk about some of the security aspects of this. But technically, you can configure this in a way where your admin application does not even need to be up and running at all times, just when you're doing the build. Although it does, obviously, it needs to be available whenever you want to create the content. And WordPress, like I said, WordPress in the decouple, it can be used as an engine that exports posts to be served as static HTML files. Headless, when people talk about headless CMS and JAMstack kind of get lumped in together. Because if you're doing JAMstack, you're probably going to be using a headless CMS or a CMS like WordPress that is, being used in that role as a headless CMS. And you could do this with others like Drupal, Joomla, .NET Nuke, all of these other different ones. They kind of work the same way. So there's different options there as well. And there's a lot of players in the headless CMS market. They all do things a little differently. As to how you interact with them. I've used probably about half a dozen different ones for different parts. This is just a list of some of the like the 10 bigger ones that are out there, some of the more popular ones. If you look at this, a lot of these, what they'll have is, some of them are strictly API. You only set up a configuration, which means you don't even have an admin UI. You have to build an app that interacts with that UI to manage your data, which is another step that you want. But if you're just looking for an easy way of doing that, or you have a system already that puts it in, there's ways to do that. These others like Netlify and Contentful, Sanity, they have an admin UI that you can configure. And for the most part, what you're doing is you're just saying, this is my content type. These are the fields I want. This is the type of field it is. Those will build forms that you can then fill out and configure the way you need. And then when you add the content through their UI, then it's in your database. And then whatever front-end system you're using, you can pull it from that. And if we have time at the end, I can log into, I have a Sanity account and show you how that works a little bit. I've been playing around with some of those. How to pick one of these, it seems like every week or two, there's a new one that comes out that is the latest and greatest headless CMS, and it's going to, change the way you work with it. You really just have to play around with them and say, okay, is my app am I going to build an admin UI, or do I want something that's built in? How complex is my data? How much data I'm going to have? A lot of these will have a free tier to store, a certain amount of data, or give you limited admin UI stuff. But you got to look at price. Some of these make a big jump from their free to their professional tier. So anytime you're doing this, look at your headless CMS and say, okay, this might work in the beginning, but am I going to have to pay a high price 6 months or a year from now when I have a lot more content on my site, or my site's getting a lot more traffic? They all use different billing models. They all do different levels of support. How you create your data. Like I said, really just read the reviews, play around with them. I've used Sanity, Contentful, and Strappy. Strappy's kind of one of the API only ones. Contentful and Sanity are ones that I've used more. I've played around with Graph CMS a little bit. Ghost is an interesting one. Ghost is kind of a full-fledged CMS, but it's set up in a way that you could use that as a headless CMS as well. So all of these lead us into being able to do these JAMstack sites. And JAMstack, the term came from Netlify, which is a big player in this market. They have an app that will do the compiling of your sites and pulling it from different data and building your site, hosting your site. It's really a redefinition of the modern web for fast, secure websites. And if you think about it, it really just breaks down into three pieces, three parts of this. Is for the most part, you're going to have a JavaScript application. Usually this is built in React or Vue. It doesn't have to be a full-on JavaScript app. It could just be an HTML app or HTML static files that have some things to it. But the one I'll be talking about most, because I have the most experience with, is Gatsby. So Gatsby, you build a React app that then pulls your data in, generates all the static files, and pushes them where they need to be. And then there's an API layer. I mentioned before, when you have that decoupled or headless model, there has to be an API layer so that your front end code can get to the back end code. Now with a static compiled site, it's not pulling that data every time. It's only doing that at the build time. So what happens is if I have this hooked up to my WordPress site, and there's some ways you can do this with some plugins, that I add a new post, that's going to then make a call to my static site generator, whichever I'm using, and say, okay, I have new content. You need to rebuild my site. And there's different ways to configure this, but then it will go through, generate all the HTML files that I need, push that site off to my server, and then I'm good to go. So that's the API that needs to be there. It's not using the API to get the data every time. And then finally, you're just giving it the markup, which is the actual HTML files, with the layout and the styles. In the case of a React app, that's going to be your different components and everything. So once you've pulled that data and parsed it and manipulated it how you need, then that plugs it into those HTML files and actually displays on your page. JAMstack's not just a buzzword or just a little trend. It is going to be the future of web development, in my opinion. Some of the big players in the market have gotten some funding, and this slide was from my talk for WordCamp Minneapolis a couple months ago. These numbers could be different now. They could have gotten more. If you look at this, this is just what VC funding has pushed into some of these companies. So Gatsby's gotten 46 million. Netlify's gotten multiple rounds, 97 million. Stratic, which is a company out of Israel. I know a couple of the people that work there, a great company there. They've gotten funding. Frontity's gotten funding. And there's a handful of others that I don't even have on this list that have gotten some seed money for this future of funding. And there's a little, controversy about JAMstack versus WordPress. And is it a this or that kind of thing? And there was just a React JAMstack React conference, online one, and Chris Poyer from CSS Trends had Matt Mullenweg and Matt, and I can't remember his last name, but I believe he's with Netlify, and they kind of had a fireside chat about, JAMstack versus WordPress. And I'll go through some of the differences and some of the benefits and stuff, but I think it's a disservice to both of them if you look at this as a either or. WordPress is great. We love WordPress. We're here on a Saturday morning talking about it. Obviously, we love it. So JAMstack is great too. And it's not like, if you go to JAMstack, are you cheating on WordPress? Are you going to break its heart? No, there's ways to make these work together. And it's going to boil down to what is the right tool, what is the right pattern and model for your situation. Not all websites are the same. And a little later, I'll get into some of the use cases of where you need, where you might use one versus the other. But I don't look at this as a developer of JAMstack versus WordPress. There are times where I'll build a JAMstack site on a, using one of the API ones and not use WordPress at all. I'm working on one now. It's a site I used to have. It's a sweepstakes site for guitar stuff, because obviously I like guitars. And I was going to do it initially with a WordPress backend. And I said, you know what? These forms, I don't need the overhead of WordPress. I don't have content. I don't have blogs. All I have are these sweepstakes that have about 10 different properties on them. So with that one, I'm just using Sanity.io as my backend CMS. And then I have a React app that it's a Gatsby React app that builds that site and publishes it, and I'm good to go. I don't need the editorial flow of WordPress. I don't have editors. I don't have writers. I'm not managing that. That's the nice thing about WordPress. Is the blackdoctor.org is the company I work for. And it's a health and wellness blog. And it's a hugely trafficked site, multiple posts per day, dozen writers, a couple editors. So there's a whole editorial process. If a lot of these headless CMS systems don't have a lot of that built in, editorial flow pieces. So if you're a publisher, WordPress gives you a lot on the backend side. You can schedule posts out. You can do a lot of these things. Have somebody write it, have somebody edit it, making sure that I can only edit certain things. And you'll see in these headless CMSs, they're doing a lot of that. They're adding a lot of that, but that's where, in that situation, you wouldn't necessarily want to move away from WordPress. But yeah, so these are some of the big players in the market. They're getting funded. This market is growing. A lot of the, complaints about JAMstack, things like build times. So when you're, the blackdoctor.org site, there's, tens of thousands of posts. So if it had to rebuild the site every time we added a new post, that's an issue. And that's the way it was working for a while. I should say too, let me just point out, we have not moved to a JAMstack site yet. I'm in the process of figuring out exactly what all is going to be involved in moving it to a JAMstack site on the front end, just for performance reasons. But we have not moved it yet. But issues like the build time, that's something that's being addressed. Gatsby Cloud just came out and they have an incremental build where it will figure out what pieces need to be built. One of the knocks on JAMstack is, you're working with, you could have 3, 4, 5 different platforms. You have your CMS piece, you have your Gatsby or Netlify that does the build, you have where you're hosting it. It may talk to 3 or 4 different players, and if one of those goes down, you have the problem. Whereas with WordPress as a monolith, it's one application. You have a server, and as long as your main server doesn't go down, you're fine. So, the static site. JAMstack technically doesn't have to be a static site if it's a React app that is calling with the API. But in general, when people refer to headless CMS or JAMstack sites, you're generally talking about the model of, I have my backend admin that I manage my content in. At some point, I'm going to have an application that runs, pulls all that content in, creates all the static HTML files, and then pushes them to a server somewhere. That's what the static site generators do. Jekyll and Hugo were some of the earlier ones. Gatsby came along and is very popular. And it works kind of in the same model. It builds a React app of all your content, static files. And then it works kind of with a plugin model that you'd be familiar with within WordPress, where there's a lot of different apps that will work with it. And things that you need to do, like there's image manipulation or different sources. So the nice thing about Gatsby is I talked about, you can use WordPress as a source. You can use Sanity.io, Contentful, all these different headless CMSs. People have developed plugins for Gatsby itself that will let you use those as the source, and then they'll communicate with it. So then on your static site app, when you on the build code, you're just saying, go get me these posts and go get me the content. You don't have to integrate, make the API calls and do everything yourself. That has kind of been built out for you. As far as which ones of these work better than the others, again, just like the headless CMSs, they all do things just a little bit differently. Gatsby is kind of the big one. Gatsby's, the bigger option, probably the more popular, one of the better ones. It's the one that I've used the most. So I'm the most familiar with that one. So that's generally what I go with. But all these others have some benefits to them. There's Next, which is popular, Nuxt. If you're building your front end in React versus Vue, I believe Nuxt is the one that's kind of built for Vue. 11D is kind of a newer static site generator, but it does a lot of things cooler. I'm not going to get into like which ones of these work better or what one does versus the other. That would be the whole talk itself. But basically, if you want to play around with these, almost all of these have some sort of getting started guide, tutorial guide. I would suggest playing with all of them. Create a static site, using each one, and just start to get a feel for how they work and what you can do with them, and then decide what's going to work best, for your particular project. Because again, just like the headless CMS, they all fundamentally do the same thing. They just do it in slightly different ways. If you have a blog site or a site that has, a lot of content in it, not a ton of interactivity, Gatsby's, I would suggest, is the way to go, just because of the amount of information out there and the amount of plugins and the amount of people working with it. Just like with WordPress, one of the things that I really liked about WordPress is not just the theme options and how many plugins there are out there, but there is a community around it, and people are willing to write blog posts and share answers on things like Stack Overflow. How do I do this? Even doing WordPress for getting close to 10 years now, I get stuck, I get lost. I'm a pretty advanced WordPress developer, but I come across things and I have to look, I have to Google it with the best of them. No Google shame here. And I'll find answers to people who've run into the same situation, and it's a really cool thing. So you're starting to see these communities build up in these different static site generators. Gatsby has a lot. It's very popular, so you get a lot of answers, a lot of blog posts about it, a lot of tutorials. The one issue that you're going to run into if you start working with this is going through a lot of these. Things change really fast with these static site generators. WordPress has changes, but it's a much slower pace because it supports so many, 30-some% of the web, and backwards compatibility, and we're still, PHP version bumps are still, way behind. But these static site generators, this moves fast. When I did this talk in WordCamp Minneapolis a couple months ago, I had slides for how to do this as a start for the starters, so the WordPress starter. And then using GraphQL as a source. And that's actually changed. There's now a way, right now we're kind of in an interim way where there's a new way of doing it, but it isn't full released yet. I will walk through that one later in the presentation, since that's the new way of doing it. So just within the last couple of months, those have changed a bit. That is one of the challenges with JAMstack, is if, Gatsby changes the way it does something, your app may have to change. If it changes the way it works with something else, or a plugin that you have, or the app that you use for your headless CMS changes something, you have moving parts that are all, kind of chasing each other to be the next big thing. So, that can be challenging. There is a lot of, risk involved in this, that, what you're doing today, you could be building an app today, and then there's a big change in something that needs to be changed. So I do a lot of WordPress development, but I'm also a React developer. And, I got pretty good at React, and then React hooks come out, and, okay, so I learned React Redux, and then context comes out. It's like, okay, well, let me just basically scrap everything I learned and go to this new next and better thing, which happens a lot. The nice part about that, though, is for all of these problems with static site generators, there are companies and people that are coming out with solutions pretty rapidly. Build time was the big thing. If I changed say I could have on a huge site, I can have a 10-minute build time. So when I add a new piece of content, it takes 10 minutes to generate and push my site to the server. I'm not worried about that site or that new content taking 10 minutes to get out. But the issue is, what if somebody else publishes a site 8 minutes in? It's going to start over again. Why don't I just put that post in with the other build? Well, there's things like pagination, recent posts. There's parts of your site that have to be regenerated every time, not just that post itself. And that's where things like, incremental builds or queuing builds or, merging builds as they're going, those are all going in there. One of the other things is, and I'll dive into this a bit more, some of the trade-offs is, when you install a WordPress theme, a good premium theme from a quality company, not just something some theme you found online in some huge marketplace where it's hit and miss. If you install a good premium theme from a quality developer, that theme is going to do a lot for you. It's going to have clean, SEO, technical SEO markup on the page. It will probably have accessibility built into it. It's going to be nice and responsive. It's going to have the SEO, the headers, the description, all those things are kind of going to be built in. When you move off of this, there's not really a theme marketplace. That's something that's starting to come out now. Zach Gordon is, I'm I would consider myself fairly an expert in JAMstack and WordPress sites, but if you want, miles ahead of me, just do everything that Zach Gordon puts out. He actually works, I believe it's Static now. Forgive me if I'm wrong, but I believe he works with Static, which is one of the companies that does static WordPress sites. He's put out courses. I've taken several of his courses. He's done sessions on this as well. He talks a lot about some of the opportunities, and he was working on, I believe it's still active, but there's a Gatsby WP themes. So basically trying to generate a theme marketplace for Gatsby sites. Because right now there's a lot of, I started out saying we're kind of going back in time doing things by hand. There's a lot of stuff you have to do by hand when you're doing a static site, a JAMstack site. That's going away. There are more and more companies coming out with, seeing the opportunities, seeing the gaps, and taking the WordPress theme and plugin model and applying it to static site generators and headless CMS and those types of things. So you're seeing those things come out, but you can't just push a button on this and have it work. There are some ways. We'll talk about hosted solutions a little later, but that's one of the big trade-offs that you have. So times you want to use a JAMstack site. This is a case-by-case basis. Yes, there are a lot of benefits, but this isn't a situation where it's like, okay, I'm going to scrap all of my WordPress sites and build them as JAMstack sites again. You might not need to. Some good examples of this is, it's content for a mobile app. If you have a site, say you have a blog and you want to have like a progressive web app. If you've gone to a site and says, add this site to your desktop, that's a progressive web app. It acts like an app on your phone, but it's really just a website. And there's ways you kind of do that behind the scenes. That's a whole talk on its own. But this is a good example of when to use a JAMstack site for something like that. If you have a microsite, so a lot of times you might have a company that has a product, and maybe there's an event that you're putting on. You're putting on a virtual event, or you're selling a course, or you have some sort of initiative. You're doing a product launch, and you want to have a standalone site from your main site that's just for whatever specific campaign you're doing. This is an example of a microsite. I built a lot of these for different companies. Maybe they have the last one I did was a company, and they had a local, they were a house buying company. Real estate investors, they'll buy, troubled houses or, quick sale. But they had a site that works with the community. It's like a charity, not for profit that help. Not kind of like a Habitat for Humanity, but at a much smaller scale. They go out and do repairs. So they had a microsite for that we built, and that's a good example of something where you might just want to use a headless CMS and a static site. A lot of people kind of by default go to WordPress because of all the plugins and all the themes. But if your site is the 5 to 10 page brochure site that you don't have a lot of interactivity, you don't have a blog, you're not adding content, WordPress isn't always the best option for that. There's a lot of overhead. It's a content management system. But if you're building a site and you don't have to manage content, it can be a little overkill. That's where you start running into the performance things. And why am I hitting a database every time somebody wants to view my About Us page? Why shouldn't that be a static site? So if you have a non-interactive site, you're not e-commerce, it's not an application. You might have a couple forms, contact me forms, things like that. But it's really just informational about your company. That's a good example of when to use a JAMstack site, because you don't need that content management. You don't need that editorial flow pieces in it. If you're just interacting with if you just have a JavaScript UI that's pulling things into another site, that's a good example of when you can use a headless CMS. And the other example, complete opposite of I just said, if you have a small microsite that you don't have a lot of interactive content, or you're not publishing a lot of content, the exact opposite works too. If you're a large publisher site, I mentioned I'm in the early stages of looking at what the migration for blackdoctor.org will be to go to a JAMstack site. This is another, because you get a lot of the benefits. Now you have to deal with things like the build times and those types of issues. But a good example of this is Smashing Magazine, which is a UI UX blog. They've been around forever. They have a ton of content. They've moved from WordPress to a static site. It's worked out for them. So there's a lot of benefits that you get, to going to a JAMstack site. So again, the case-by-case basis, you might have a small 5-page website. That's a good example for using JAMstack, or you might have a huge site with thousands of posts that gets a ton of traffic a day. That could make a case for using a JAMstack site. Some of the advantages is, there's flexibility and control. You're not restricted to the template-based system of WordPress. The trade-off of that is you have to do some of this yourself. You might have to have some React or JavaScript or HTML knowledge to be able to do it, but you're not having to just be restricted to what themes you have available. You can migrate your content and publish it to multiple channels. You could have different places that you have this this information, a phone app, your website, a feed of some kind. You might syndicate content to other apps that use this. That's the multi-channel publishing. It's reliable. These are static HTML files. So unless if the server that these files sit on go down, there's not going to be an issue. It's HTML files with the assets that go with them. And then there's low maintenance on this because on a WordPress website, you could be using anywhere from 2 to 60 plugins. And there's always the question of how many plugins are too many. Or how many plugins do you need plugins to do all the functionality your site needs. There's no such thing as too many plugins if that's what your site needs to run. And I took over a site. I think the most I ever saw was 110 active plugins on a website. That was too many. I'll take that back, because they had 3 or 4 different plugins that were doing basically the same thing that a series of developers had worked on the site, and they said, oh, well, I'm familiar with this one. I'm going to put this one on. They had 3 forms. They had 3 redirects. It was a little crazy. We got them down to, I think about 40 or 50 different plugins. And that's as many as they needed on their site. It was a very complex site. So you run it, you don't have that maintenance issue of finding these plugins or managing these plugins and having to configure them for for caching, firewall, security, backups, all of those things. And static files don't really break. You could run into issues where it could happen on a build where something gets a little wonky, something doesn't quite build right, and then your site is broken. Then you do the rebuild. That I haven't come across that. I know in some of the earlier days of this, maybe a file doesn't get included just right, and it's a necessary file. Really doesn't happen with these builders. They're pretty reliable. A static file, an HTML file, really isn't going to break. It's going to be hard to make that buggy, because if it builds, you're pretty much going to be in good shape. Where you could run into issues is if you have JavaScript on your site, or maybe it's a third-party JavaScript and that piece isn't working, or if you're relying on an API for part of your content, that might not work. So there's a lot of benefits that you get. There are some trade-offs as well, which we'll get into. Sorry, I just going through my notes. Yeah. So the first big benefit of this is the speed of the site. I've mentioned a couple times, when you're on a WordPress site and you make a request for a blog post, it's hitting the database, it's doing dozens of queries, hundreds of queries, getting all of that, formatting it, running all the plugins that need to be plugged in. The theme is doing its thing, spitting out the menu, all of the the SEO, the open graph, all of those things are running, and then it spits out the page at the end. That is a long process, even for a simple site. And if you're on depending on your hosting and what kind of server you have, that's a big thing. But and yes, again, I will say, having a good caching plugin and serving assets from a CDN, there are ways that you can speed up WordPress that are competitive with a static site. But that's we talked about that maintenance side of it is you're having to configure these things, you're having to work with these things. There are times where caching can cause weird issues and things. So there's a trade-off, but speed is probably the biggest factor of moving to a JAMstack site. So the beauty of this is, what are you serving? You're serving an HTML file. That's the page on your website. It's going to include some JavaScript. You can have third-party JavaScript as well. It's your CSS file. It's your images. It's the static assets. Maybe it's a PDF file or some downloadable file, whatever it may be. All of these are static pieces of they're just files that sit on a server somewhere. And then the other nice thing about this is there are plugins with Gatsby that will do your image optimization. When you build the site, your JavaScript and CSS, you can minimize that. You can concatenate all the different pieces that are in your site. Just like there's plugins that will do that now on your WordPress site. And what that basically is it takes all of your CSS, it optimizes it, minimizes it, so it's a small download. Same thing with the JavaScript. You can, as part of your site build process for your JavaScript app, it will it will concatenate all your JavaScript files into one, minimize it, optimize it, pretty it. There's plugins for prettier, so it follows certain standards. Same thing with HTML. Your images can be optimized. So as part of that build process, what you might have, a couple of different plugins on the WordPress side to do, it will do that as well. So not only are you just static HTML files, they've also been optimized for performance as well. And when I do want to add, I'm talking about serving a static site. So you say, well, what if I need, to pull current data or something like I want to have the weather widget on my site. Well, when I build that site, whatever the weather is at that time, that's what's going to go on that page. That's obviously not what I want. You can have hybrid sites. So what I mean by this is it generates a static site. It's static HTML, everything's optimized. But within that, you can still have JavaScript or React that will then call another API and pull data in and display it on your site in a hybrid way. But not everything is interactive. So all of my page, my community information page about where I live is all static. But I want to pull in the weather. I basically can have like a React or JavaScript widget more or less that calls an API. So when my static site builds, what it's going to say is in this area, on load, run this script, pull that data in from whatever API and display it on the page. So that when somebody comes to the page, that part is going to be interactive and run when they come to the page, but everything around it is going to be static. As far as the question of what do you do hybrid versus what do you do static, that's going to be up to you, up to your situation. Does it need to be real time? Is it something that could be old data? Does it matter? I ran into an issue. I'll give you a good example of this. I ran into an issue on that sweepstakes site that is a static site where if it doesn't put a new sweepstakes every day, what happens when one expires? There's an expiration date on it. You have to enter by a certain date. So I have to enter by 11/14. Okay, so that's there. My site doesn't build tomorrow. That site or that sweepstakes doesn't show, expired. It looks like it's still active, even though you can't enter it anymore because that site didn't build. That's not there. So it might be something where I want to have a list of expired, or I want to go back through and check, is this expired? I could do that each time. Or if I have an ending soon, that might be dynamic. So that's ordered by, the page loads. It's all the site, all the content. But that one little section is going to say, okay, I've loaded. Go get me all of the sweepstakes that are about to end and display them on the page. So when I come to the page, everything's loading. There might be a little loader for a second. That's a hybrid app. So you can add as much interactivity if you're calling third-party APIs or you need to do something. That's possible as well. And you'll still get a lot of the benefit of the JAMstack site. And I'll talk a little bit later about some of the interactive things on your page that you trade off from using this. So speed is the big reason a lot of people will go to JAMstack. Maybe not the best reason, but serving static files, and there's a couple additional ways that you can speed that up. So, and that brings us to the scalability of the site. WordPress being a PHP application that hits a database, say you get 3,000, 3,000 visits a month, which is, a good small website with traffic. And then you do a post and it gets picked up and you go viral and now you're getting 1 million hits. What do you think is going to happen to your poor little server that's used to getting 3,000 hits and your shared hosting? It's not going to handle it. There are ways, you can do things and improve in different, elastic sites and cloud hosting and things. But for most sites, you're going to be on a not necessarily a shared plan, but you're going to be on a host that meets your needs. If you have a JAMstack static site, it's not hitting the database every time. It's not doing all these things. And even with caching, there's still issues where you're going to hit the database. It's an app. You're going to be able to serve those files this, much higher scale. If you still might see a slowdown because of the amount of people hitting the site, but there's no database. I'll give you an example. I worked on a site, and this was the site was a mess because this was another one where there'd been probably a dozen different developers on it, and somebody came in to do their SEO for them, and they put in tags of every possible variation of their keywords and key phrases, which is a terrible idea. It's not just ineffective, but it's dangerous because you could get penalized by Google for doing so. It was keyword stuffing. Hey, I started this out by saying I worked in the 90s. There were ways you could do SEO. That was, white text on a white background, just keyword stuffing. Those were the good old days. Obviously, that doesn't work anymore, but they were basically keyword stuffing these tags. So the issue was, there's about, 5, I don't know how many posts, 5,000, 8,000. There was a lot of posts. And every post probably had, 10 to 15, 20, 30 tags to them sometimes. So there's, like 20, 30,000 tags for a site in a WordPress site. And that's obviously not the way tags are supposed to be used. In fact, if you look at it, the tags, when you select them, it throws off the whole, the whole interface of WordPress because it's not intended to have, dozens of tags for a post. My point of this is, with some of the plugins that had to check tags and things, as those got added more and more, it ended up causing the server to spike and then bringing the site down if traffic got over a certain point, because everybody, it was having to query all these tags, loop through all these tags. And this was in a situation, now obviously this was a bad situation where somebody was doing something they shouldn't, but having to query that and process that, and that number of tags brought down the site. With a static site, the more hits that you get, you're not putting any more strain on that server other than pushing the files. And that helps with a lot of things. It helps with availability. Like I said, your site's not going to go down. You can push your files to a CDN, a content delivery network, because they're just HTML files and static files. They're easier to host. You don't need a server with a database. You don't need a server with PHP. You don't need any of that. It's just file storage. And there's cloud storage. Amazon has their cloud file storage. Google Firebase or Google Cloud has storage. You can use things like Cloudflare. There's Fast CDN. There's a million different CDNs out there that you can push your files to. And the benefit of this is when you have your 3,000 visit site and you go viral for something and you get 2 million visitors, these CDNs can handle that. They're made for that. So it's going to be available. Your site is not going to go down for that. And you're going to get all of that traffic, which is what you want. And I'm using the example of a sudden traffic spike, but just in general, the availability is going to be there. It's location based, a lot of these CDNs. So if I'm coming to your site from Chicago and our friend Louise is from the UK, she's coming to our site from the UK, these CDNs, she's not going to hit a server, in Dallas, Texas. She's going to hit a server somewhere in the UK. I'm going to hit, maybe Milwaukee has a server that's closest to me. So this location, they call it edge-based. That's going to help with the speed. My download times are going to go down for my site because if I leverage a CDN for my statically generated site, it's going to get the performance boost of that. And again, the big thing of being, no PHP, no MySQL. There is JavaScript that's going to run on the site. You may be calling a third-party API for part of your site, that hybrid model. That could take some time. There's issues with that, but for the most part, your site, static files pushed to a CDN is going to be, super fast. And that is not only going to help with user experience, that's a Google PageRank, or that's a Google ranking factor, is how fast does your site load. So a faster site, better rankings. The Google's moving to mobile first indexing. So obviously, static site on a phone, if somebody's on 4G or 5G, they're not somewhere where they have Wi-Fi and they're looking at your site, it's going to load a lot faster. Google's going to know that, and you're going to rank higher. Your site's going to be available. That to me is more important than the speed of the site, is being able to handle those spikes and being closer, and then not having to worry about, does my server have enough memory? Do I have enough PHP workers to be able to do this? Is this many queries on my database going to slow down my database or cause locking issues? I don't have to worry about any of that at that point. The big thing about JAMstack sites, and this is a little controversial one in the WordPress world, is the security of this. And this was one of the debates in that fireside chat that came up a lot. WordPress has a bad reputation for being insecure. And it's not necessarily deserved, but it is fairly accurate. WordPress, if you have security around it, if you're doing things like limiting login attempts, so people can't just barrage your site with login attempts. There's a lot of tools out there, security, word fence. There's a lot of things that will help lock down your site. WordPress's biggest issue is the WordPress users, where you don't update your plugins, you don't update your site, and there's a flaw, and somebody finds it, and somebody gets in. I've had my own sites hacked, which is so embarrassing as a WordPress developer, to have your own site. In fact, I just had one. It was a staging site I had set up, and I just had it sitting out there, and I kind of went back to it to get something, and it had been hacked. And I was like, oh man, because I wasn't updated. There was probably some plugin that I hadn't updated. I hadn't looked at the site in almost a year, didn't update it. So that happens. But the problem is, every time that happens, it gets out in the news. These are just some of the recent headlines. This is headlines from the last 6 months about different, WordPress vulnerabilities. And these make big news because if you look at, if you think about it, WordPress having 30-some% of the web, if I'm a hacker or a hacking group or something, if I could find an exploit in a popular plugin, I'm all of a sudden going to have access to, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of websites. And most of these exploits are not even, people say, well, why would they attack my site? I am just a little, pizza shop from my local town. They're not attacking your site. They're attacking every site. There are scripts that just run and say, okay, does this site have this flaw? Can I exploit it? Yes. Okay, let me in, and then do something later, because they're not attacking you personally. They're just attacking random websites that they can get into, because then, what they'll do is they'll, sell those hacked sites to somebody who wants to redirect things to, some Chinese pharma hack, or, whatever crazy things that they do. But a WordPress site that has, a security plugin put into it, with, plugins managed and updated, and there's tools you can use like Manage WP. WP Engine has a plugin automator. A lot of the good hosts have automatic plugins. WordPress itself, just in, I think it was it the last release or the one before, has an automatic plugin updater. So to try to keep your updates or your plugins updated to keep it secure. Again, WordPress, it has the reputation of being insecure, but it's really not. It's just unmaintained websites that don't have a layer of security around over them are at risk when these exploits come out. The reason that a static site is going to be less vulnerable is you can't hack an HTML file. The only real hack that could happen is if somebody gets access to one of your accounts that builds this. And one of the risks is you may have 4 or 5 different accounts that are used for the building of your website. You could have your Headless CMS. You could have, like your Netlify or Gatsby Cloud that builds the site. You could have where you're hosting it. If any of those get attacked or compromised in some way, yes, then your site is going to be at risk. but you're never reading or writing to the database. That is the big issue. Is if you have a website, and I just came across a site not too long ago that had a form that you could fill out, and it wasn't cleaning or sanitizing the data that went in. So you could do a cross-site scripting attack. I could put in a malicious piece of JavaScript that when you load this page, calls some API with your cookie value in it. And guess what? If you're an admin user and I have your cookie, I can then put that cookie in my browser session, go in, and I'm now an admin. I'm now you on your site, and then I can do anything I want. That's where cross-site script XSS attacks come in. So you can't write to the database. Now, having said that, you have to make sure that what you're putting into your database is secure. Obviously you're not going to hack your own site, but you could leave, weird, there could be weird things where if somebody can get, hack your JavaScript and they could write a cookie or something. It's not 100% secure. Nothing is ever 100% secure. But if it's a static site and people are just hitting your website over and over again, trying these different exploits, they're not going to get in. The other nice thing about this is with the headless CMS, and that's a risk. Somebody could somehow get into your backend system, but there are other ways of doing this. If you're using WordPress as your headless CMS, you may not need your WordPress site up and running all the time. And there's tools that will spin up your WordPress site and then shut it down. So if you're adding content, on Tuesday, you could spin up your WordPress site, do everything you need to do, build the site, and then shut your WordPress site, your admin site, back down again. It's a little extreme, but that's another great way of making your site super secure when you're doing JAMstack. The other approach you can take is you can really lock down your admin side. You can restrict it by IP address, through your server. You can restrict it through a secondary password on the server level to even get to the admin side that you need it. There's a lot of ways on the server that you can harden your admin side. Obviously, you can't do that if it's a WordPress front end because you can't make people jump through these hoops to get to it. But there are ways if you're doing the headless site, lock down that admin side so people aren't hitting your admin. Because if you have your WordPress site up 24/7, but you're using a JAMstack static site generator with WordPress as your headless CMS, your WordPress site admin side is still going. That's still vulnerable. So there are a lot of ways that you can really lock down that site. I suggest at the very least is either IP restricted to your IP address if you're the only one using it, or have some sort of password to do it and do it that way, because then your admin side is not vulnerable and your front end is not. And again, bottom line, WordPress is secure when you do everything right. You don't always do everything right. I don't always do everything right. I had somebody call up one of my personal sites and say, hey, I think your site was hacked. And I was like, oh, are you kidding me? It's super embarrassing, but it happens. And I know, I know what I'm doing, and I still don't always do it. So this is another way where it's not moving to a JAMstack site, not 100% secure, but you are getting a lot of these things out. So if you're using a plugin like that was in one of these headlines where 700,000 sites and 1 million sites, you're probably using one of those plugins, and it's like, oh no, make sure you got to get in there and update it so that issue goes away. And that goes back to the lower maintenance of it. You don't have to to do a lot of that stuff that you would on the WordPress site. Some of the trade-offs of this is, remember, this is static HTML files. It'll have some JavaScript, it'll have some images and everything, but these are static sites. So what do you lose? Well, you lose search. Site search is built into WordPress. I just put that little box on my site and I do it, and it knows how to do it, and it does it for me. There isn't a built-in static search because depending on what headless CMS you're using, you have to go and search this database. There was just a great talk, and I don't have it in the notes, and I wish I had it. This was at that JAMstack conference, and it was how to build a search. So there's a couple different approaches to this. One is you could have an API-based search on your headless CMS. So when you search it, You say, go off to this, have some sort of query that finds posts in that, and then brings them back out and does the result. The issue with this is a lot of these headless CMSs don't really have that search functionality built into them. So what you can do is, while you build your site, the way Google does this is Google will crawl your site, read all of your content, and then index your content. So it basically just says, these are the words, these are the phrases, this is how many times they appear, these are in this site. They do a whole other level of that, of natural language processing of, okay, these are the words on the site. This is what we think they mean by these words. This is what somebody searching for will probably want to see these words, and they have a whole other level of that. But that's they're indexing your site. They're taking an inventory of the content of your site to find keywords, key phrases, and then processes that to say, okay, this is what these words probably mean in this context, and then displaying that in the search results. There are some apps and some tools to do this for the search during that build time. So when you add content and you say, okay, build my site. So your site's going to go off to your headless CMS. It's going to pull down all of your content. It's going to run through it. It's going to parse it. It's going to do everything it needs to do, optimize your images, optimize your JavaScript and CSS, create the static files, push them to the server. As part of that process, it's going to go through and say, okay, build an index of all that content as well. And this is where, this is not something you're going to want to code by hand, obviously, but it will then parse all of that content, create an index of all of your posts, and then have the search. So now this is where it's going to be kind of one of those hybrid things. And if you do it all at once, or if you have a giant file that gets created, there's a couple different approaches, and it's really going to depend on how big your site is, how much content you have, how you want to do this. You might want to have it in chunks. You might want to have it in some sort of like a database, something like a Firestore database. There's a lot of different approaches you can do to this. But then when you search, it's going to say, okay, and this could be a hybrid one where it's going to say, okay, load up that file that I have. It might be part of the web page itself. It might be through an API. Do that parsing, find out what keywords I'm looking for, do that search, and then dynamically display those results. Your search results page is not going to be static. Technically, it could be, but you don't want to have a static site for every possible search combination you could have. Because you don't know how people are going to search. You might want to have like your category archives or your tag archives. Those could be static as well. But that search will then parse that index file and display some results for you in that hybrid model that I mentioned before, where that search result page is going to be generated on the fly, but the index of your keywords is going to be created statically at build time. So there are ways to do search. And this is another great example of, when static sites started out, there just was no search. You had to build it yourself. Now there's companies and tools out there and apps and different open source projects that are saying, oh, this is an opportunity. Let me build a piece of search for it. And this is one that changes. There's different ways of doing that. The approach in the beginning was to create that one static file and include it on your web page. But then if your site gets bigger, now that's a huge piece of download. It's going to take your page longer to download. It may take a while to parse. You could run into memory issues in the browser. So there's, again, all the trade-offs, but this is one where you're starting to see a lot of things come into the market. The other bad one is e-commerce. If you have a static site, this is great for your inventory and your catalog. I'm sorry, it's great for your catalog, but not your cart. Also, this is another good example of where you're going to want kind of that hybrid model. Because if I have a store and I have, and I track inventory and I have 8 items left in inventory, and somebody comes in and buys one, and I've got a static generated site, and somehow they buy one, which we'll just pretend that they somehow can. That site hasn't rebuilt. It still shows that I have 8 in stock. It's not reflecting it. Also, the cart, the shopping cart can't be a dynamic page, because this is something where they come in and they're adding something to their cart and then they do the checkout. Obviously, this is going to change for every person who comes in. You can't have your shopping cart as a static site. This is where that hybrid model comes in. Also, more importantly, if I want to have e-commerce on my site, I'm just pretty much going to install WooCommerce, and it's going to give me a ton of stuff out of the box. And there's a million different plugins, and I really could do almost whatever I want with free and premium plugins for WooCommerce. There are, again, companies that are starting to build e-commerce things for static sites, and they're API-based driven. So this is the hybrid model again, where I might have my product page is going to be a static page, but maybe my ratings, my reviews, or my inventory, how many items left, that's going to be dynamic. So when that page loads, it's going to load a piece of script. It's a static page that loads. It's going to load a piece of script. It says, okay, go query an API for this item and tell me how many of these do I have left in stock. Okay, and show that live on the page. And again, when I go to the cart, everything around the cart could be a static page like it would be normally, but my cart rows, how many items I have in my cart, my subtotal, all of that is going to be dynamic. And that's a script, and that may have, and you have to save that cart somewhere. So you're going to have, a database somewhere that stores your cart information. And there are third-party companies that kind of have these as API-driven carts, or you might build something yourself where you're hitting, like a Firestore database or an Amazon database, whatever it may be, to store your cart information. That hybrid piece is going to pull it and bring it in. So that's another trade-off. Right now, if you have a strictly e-commerce site, JAMstack is probably not the best option for you right now, just because there's going to be a lot of roadblocks kind of getting in the way to getting that going. You can do it. There are ways to do it, but this is one where right now, a JAMstack site is maybe not necessarily up to what you need to do a site. It will be at some point, but that's one of the trade-offs where this might be a case where JAMstack's not a good site. The forms on your webpage, in WordPress, you install forms like Gravity Forms, Ninja Forms, WP Forms. There's Caldera is part of Ninja now. There are tons of forms plugins out there, and they're all great. They all do things a little differently. But when you want to submit a form, just even if it's just a contact form, a static website, name, email, comments, submit. I click that submit button. What does it do? Where does it go? I don't have an interactive site that's going to email me that they got this form and save this form submission in a database somewhere. There's nothing on the static site. This is one there's a lot of options now. Some free, some paid. There's API, third-party API SaaS service. And I apologize, but I sometimes say SaaS and API interchangeably. But there's SaaS services that through an API, I can submit a form. Netlify, which is a big player in the JAMstack space for building sites, hosting your sites, they have a forms module. So this is, again, it's that hybrid model where you push that button on the form, it's going to call an API, save that form someplace. There's a third-party system. It's going to handle that, process that, save it for you, send it to you, send a notification to them, whatever you may expect from a WordPress forms plugin, and that's handled on the site. And that's one where, again, third-party people are filling that gap. Forms is probably the one that has the most robust ones now. Comments is another one. If you have a site with comments, you can do things like adding discusses. That's all embedded. But same thing with forms is, how do I manage those comments? And there are third parties that now have APIs and SaaS products out there that will manage comments for your site. Question: do you want to have comments? That's a whole other argument there. But again, kind of the same way as forms, a static site, you're not going to be able to do that. It's going to be pulled in, because when the build site, if there's been a thread of comments since that last build, those comments aren't going to be included. Now, the nice thing about this is some of these, especially with e-commerce and comments, is you could build your site. It can check and say, are there new comments? Maybe in the build process, it pulls all those comments in at once and then shows them on the site up to current date. And then if you add a comment, it's going to add it to your page as you go. So some of these systems, like with forms, e-commerce, and comments, they might be able to have a plugin for, for Gatsby in my case, that will pull that data, and when you build your site, put everything that it needs to on the site. That's just depends on what platform you're using. The last big trade-off, and these are just the major ones that are, you're going to have a lot of other things that you may not be able to do as easily on a JAMstack site. But these are like kind of the big ones that are more popular, and that's memberships. If I'm, hitting a static site with just HTML pages, and I have different content for different, membership levels on my site, how do I know this person coming in is a member? They're not logged in. This is a static site. I don't have any way to know, who they are. I may have them log in somewhere and have, save a cookie and they come there, but it's a static site. They could technically, if it's saying, I could with JavaScript just hide data, but I could look at the source and get data that I'm not supposed to. So memberships are another challenge if you have a JAMstack site of how do I know which pages to display to which members. I'll admit I'm not aware of a lot of what the options are out there in the market right now for membership sites. I know there are some. I know there are some SaaS and API ones that will build your site different pages based on membership and maybe route differently. But this is one where you're going to be kind of in that hybrid model again, just because you can't have the same page show for everybody based on membership if that content is going to be different. So, memberships is one that's going to be an issue. And that's going to be one where you can still do it as a JAMstack site and get all the benefits of that, but that's going to have to be a hybrid API model. And that's where, anytime you have, search might be built into the site, but anytime you're using a third-party system, an API for e-commerce forms, comments, memberships, any interactive stuff that you have on the site, this is going to be one of those times where, the security may become an issue again. A big part about this is when this is supplied by a third party, they're probably handling that. That's going to be part of it because, if I have a forms SaaS and I find out, that my system is vulnerable, that's not going to be a good thing. And obviously people aren't going to want to use my system anymore. So that's one where, you're introducing risks into your site then, but there should be handled by those companies, but there's no guarantee. So anytime you add that kind of hybrid database model, now you're opening yourself back up again. But it's a trade-off. If you need to have e-commerce or if it's a membership site, that's the risk that you have to take. All right, so like I said before, the good news is we can use WordPress for the static sites. It's not built, it's not built in, but there are some tools that we can use. And I'm going to just go through a couple of these. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on all of these because there's a couple different options, but there's kind of two paths that you can go on. One is kind of the do-it-yourself model, and then one is kind of a hosted model. I was the DIY type as a developer, but there might be times where you want to have a static site, but you don't have the technical skills. So there's kind of two paths that we can take with this. And I just list a couple companies and platforms in each. There's a lot of out there. There's more coming out, but this is the way we can do. And I will, if I have time a little later, just kind of show you a demo site, but I'm not going to walk through all of the different options here in any great detail. I just want to give you some of the options that are out there that you can explore. The DIY, you're going to need some technical skills or a developer for this. And what I say by technical skills is you might have to edit, config files that are, in a JSON format, or you might have to, do things under the hood a little bit that aren't necessarily an options panel. There's a lot of WordPress developers that can modify PHP files, but they can't necessarily write one from scratch. Or you can copy and paste stuff. You understand it enough, but you might not consider yourself full-on developer. That goes from you can do this completely from scratch, or you can modify existing things out there. Gatsby has some nice quick starts, some nice tutorials. They have some starters, which we'll talk about in a bit, that kind of give you for you, where then all you're doing is kind of modifying a config file that lets you do that. But it can be a little scary because it's not like a WordPress setting. You're in an actual text file and you have to make sure you have things in quotes right, and that can be a little intimidating to some people. But some of these, that's the level that you have to do. Front-to-T will do this as well. WP to static is a plugin that will generate static HTML files. It does it kind of at a different level than a caching plugin would. caching plugin is just there on the server so that it doesn't have to do that round trip. WP2 static kind of creates those static files a little differently. I'll admit I have not used it. I can't really go into the benefits of it or that, because for me, when I do something, I'm going to do it as a as a developer. I'm probably going to do something on the DIY side of it. So, and there's a lot of different more. These are the really popular ones, but you're going to need some sort of technical skills in order to be able to do these. Now, if you want it done for you, there's a couple good, a couple easier ways to do that. Shifter is one I have not used. I'm not real familiar with them, but that will take a site and it'll take a WordPress site and create a static site. Static is the same thing. Static is, I mentioned Zach Gordon before. He was working with Static. They got funding. I believe they're out of Israel, but they're a popular option. Basically with them, you hook up your WordPress site to that, and that will generate the static site for you. So this is probably the most hosted one. Least work that you have to do is if you go with Static, is you basically have your WordPress site and then it picks everything up and kind of does it for you. So that's a great option. If you have a site, again, you're going to run into issues depending on the interactivity of that, but for your main sites, this is going to be a good option. HardyPress, I played around with that. This isn't so much on the static side, but I wanted to mention it because I mentioned before, if you're doing a headless CMS, if you're doing a JAMstack site and using WordPress as the back end, but you can only have it up and running when you want to add content. Obviously, if you have a dozen writers and editors, you want for them. But HardyPress will basically spin up your website and let you edit things as you go from there as well, which is another nice way of locking it down. And they do some other stuff, but that's a good approach to that. If it's my own site and I'm doing it as a static site, I just fire it up, enter my content, let the build do its thing, and once it's built, shut it back down. The nice thing about this is with WordPress being super popular and with Gatsby being super popular, these work well together. There's a lot of crossover. A lot of WordPress people like to work in Gatsby. And Gatsby obviously is with WordPress being so popular, wants to work with Gatsby as well. So this is kind of it's a good combination. This is a good way. I said before, this isn't JAMstack versus WordPress. This is how can we make these work together? We just had, it's a time of healing. It's a time of healing and unity. So let's let WordPress and Gatsby show us the way and work well together. Again, I mentioned Gatsby will pull your content from your WordPress site and create the site for you. The nice thing about this is there's a couple different ways that you can have Gatsby pull data from your site. I mentioned there's a REST API already built into WordPress. You can do that with the REST API, but there's better options that are just going to make your life a lot easier, and that can be done with plugins, which I'll mention in a little bit. And there's, there's plugins that you can add to WordPress that makes it a good source for Gatsby to get the data, where you're not having to change a lot of things. The nice thing about Gatsby is I mentioned before, they don't call them themes, they call them starters. And this is some of the WordPress-based starters. There's kind of a base version, one based on 2020. There's this WPL GraphQL starter, but that's kind of been replaced with one that I'll show you that's just coming out. But what's nice about these is you can install these. And when you're doing the JAMstack site, I should add too, if you are going the DIY approach, you're going to need kind of another set of skills to be familiar with, and that's things like the command line, like npm or yarn if you're using that to install things. Gatsby itself is a command line tool to do the builds. So if you're going to do this, you should be comfortable with the command lines. Now, the nice part about this is there are a ton of tutorials and examples out there that will show you how to do these things. But there is kind of that you're going to have that comfort level. Like to install one of these starters, you have to see Gatsby new, name the site, and then which starter you want, and then it will pull everything and download, run all kinds of stuff. Some of these, if you want to add additional Gatsby plugins, you have to install that plugin to Gatsby, by saying, Gatsby era, npm install what it is, and then go into your Gatsby config file. And I'll show you some of the code at the end of the talk, just so you get an idea. Change things in the config file. So there is that level of technical skills needed. It's not just like WordPress where you can, go on a host, install it, upload a theme, and be good to go. These starters all take a little work, and then getting them to point to your site, and then some things that you can do on your site. The simplest is just there's a Gatsby starter WordPress. This is the one I used to use. It's almost a little outdated now. There's better ways to use WordPress as a source for your Gatsby site. But this was a nice quick start where basically all you did is run this starter, put your site's URL in the config file, and as long as your permalinks were set as post name, then you were fine. And that's one of the restrictions on this one was you had, your permalinks had to be post name. There's a more powerful and flexible approach, and this is kind of the recommended way of doing this now. So Jason Ball, WordPress developer, has been working on WP GraphQL for a while, and I believe he may work for Gatsby now, if I remember correctly. But WP GraphQL is a way to allow you to do GraphQL queries in WordPress. And just a quick overview of GraphQL is right now most APIs are REST APIs. So the big difference is with a REST API, it's a specific URL, it's a specific address you go to. So I might say, my URL /users/14, where 14 is the ID of the user, and then I get that user. GraphQL is works a little differently. Oh, and then when I say get user, it has all of the fields of that user. And then if I say I want users posts as well, I can say, user /14/posts. And that's a completely different call. And I have to figure out when I'm building my API, how many of these different variations I want, and how am I going to pass in my options. With GraphQL, it works a little differently where my query is going to be users, and I'm going to specify what fields I want. I might not want all their posts, or if they're posts, I might just want a title and the link. I don't want any of the content. I don't want any of the images. I don't want any of that. So GraphQL is a more flexible way of doing that. Now, the issue is GraphQL is not native to WordPress. The REST API is built into WordPress core, but there is no GraphQL for WordPress itself without the WP GraphQL plugin. Installing this, I'm not 100% sure, but I believe you have to install this manually. I don't believe it's in the WordPress repo. I always install it from GitHub anyway because I have a build process. So WP GraphQL is a WordPress plugin that you can download and install on your site, which is now going to let your site do the GraphQL queries. That starter that I showed you, this starter that I showed you, this uses something called Gatsby Source WordPress. This would be using the WordPress API, the REST API, to get your data. But this one with GraphQL will do it. There's a second plugin that you want, which is WP Gatsby. It kind of works behind the scenes, but what it does is it optimizes the way that GraphQL will work with your WordPress data. It gives you, some caching and things, optimizes the queries to make them fast. So you want these two plugins on your WordPress site if you're going to be using it as the WordPress backend. And I believe both of these have to be installed from GitHub. I don't believe they're in the WordPress repo, but I could be wrong on that. So don't believe that. But all you do is download it, say, manually upload it. It's not that big a deal. Part of WP GraphQL is a third piece, which is WP GraphEQL or GraphIQL. I call it GraphEQL. And what this is a really cool tool. It's a GraphQL playground right in your WordPress admin. And I'll demo this after the talk. So it's very helpful because you can kind of test your queries. You can build your queries. You can learn how GraphQL works in it. And it's right in your WordPress admin, which is very helpful to have there. And that's part of GraphQL. And you can disable that if you don't want it in there. But if you are going to be doing this, it's a great way to play around. There are third-party tools that you can get for any platform that work as, apps that work as a GraphQL playground, where you can create your queries, run them, test them, see what works and what doesn't. And then the nice thing about that is if you're customizing the way that your site works, you can then just copy that GraphQL right out of the WordPress admin and put it in your code, and it will work the same. So what I'm doing now, and this is, I mentioned this kind of a new way, that Gatsby source WordPress, and then before you could have the WP GraphQL plugin, and then there was a Gatsby source GraphQL add-on that you could say, this is how I want my content to come from in Gatsby. Those would work together. There's a little bit of configuration that you had to do. That's no longer the recommended way to do it, because there were the there was the 2 ways. You could do the source WordPress Gatsby plugin that uses the REST API. You can install a GraphQL on your WordPress site and then you source GraphQL. But with WordPress, if you have GraphQL and WP Gatsby installed, you'll want to use this Gatsby source WordPress experimental. That experimental name is going to go away at some point, and it's probably just going to be Gatsby source WordPress, but it's going to use GraphQL, and it's going to be much more optimized and much easier to work with. So this is the one that I'm using now if I'm doing a headless WordPress site. I think it's I knowing full well that Gatsby plugin at some point I'm going to have to change. And this approach is pretty easy. You just create a new WordPress Gatsby, or I'm sorry, you just create a new Gatsby website. This will pull down that starter that has all of that, that has that built into it. Make sure that your WordPress site has GraphQL and WP Gatsby plugins installed on it. You change one setting on your config file, and then you add that Gatsby source GraphQL plugin to Gatsby, and then you change your URL in the config file, and then you're ready to go. It's ready to pull off the site. And I'll demo that, don't worry. But that's kind of the approach that you take now, which is pretty simple. And just to give you an idea, Gatsby is a command line tool. So when I say Gatsby new, and then I give it a source, it's almost like cloning a repo from GitHub. It's going to create on my whatever local folder that's going into. It's going to create a Gatsby site there. It's going to pull down that starter, and that starter is going to have all the files that generate the actual site. And then I'm just specifying where that content is going to come from in the beginning and go from there. The nice part about this that I should add is you can have multiple sources of data when you build your site. So you could have your WordPress content there. If you had another database somewhere, or another website, even another WordPress site that you want to compile these things to, you can do that with having different sources on your site, and then pulling. And the way you just do that is when you're doing those GraphQL queries to build the content, you're just doing different queries. It gets Gatsby's a little opinionated about your queries. You can't necessarily add parameters in because it builds these requests statically at runtime. So there are some limitations around it. But when you start building your pages, there's ways you can do it. I don't want to get too in the weeds technically, but you can have things coming from different sources as well in your site, but then you have to add some additional code. That won't work with these starters. These starters are expecting you to have kind of one piece of that. You can also do this all manually. You can just create a Gatsby site, add your source, Gatsby source GraphQL, and then configure it yourself, and then create your own code. But then you're going to have issues like with pagination and styling and all that. You're going to have to build all that by hand, which you can absolutely do. I've done it as an experiment, just for developing. But these starters really give you a nice jump to start from. The issue is sometimes these starters have a lot of additional pieces in there too. So things like Gatsby image, which will optimize your images, linting and prettifying. It'll do a lot of stuff with your code as well. So these starters are kind of a good, powerful tool to get going. But you can also do all of this manually by hand if you want. It's just going to be more work. And it's a trade-off because I worked with some of the starters that did way more stuff than I wanted it to, but it's a block to build on. It's a little easier, I think, to do it by hand and to kind of go in and try to remove stuff from these starters, but it's just going to depend on your project and which way you go. With this GraphQL approach, if you're using a starter, your posts and pages and navigation and everything will be in there pretty much for you to begin with. But if you are doing a more manual approach or you're building it yourself, you're going to have to create your page and post templates or any templates for custom post types that you have. And this will be kind of, React-based app. You'll have all the different components. There's a create pages API within Gatsby that basically says, I query my content, give me all the posts. Let's just say we have a simple WordPress site that just has, a handful of pages and 100 posts, 100 blog posts in it. I was going to say, give me all of those pages, and it knows the difference between a page and a post. Create pages, and then loop through each of those posts and create the posts and add whatever I need, whatever header I need. There's things you can use like React Helmet, which will add stuff into the head element. So if you have, open graph, your page title, your meta descriptions, things like that, create the content. It'll handle doing the images and everything. You'll have to add, if you're doing this by hand, you'll have to add navigation. There's no, out of the box menu, there's no menu builder like you have in WordPress. Again, the image handling, Gatsby has an optimizer, Gatsby image, that will do, in WordPress, when you have an image, it will give you that source set. It'll give you all the different things, there's, lazy loading and all that. There's plugins that will do that. If there's pagination, there are Gatsby plugins that will help you with this, but you have to remember, you have to build that in yourself. All of the styling. The nice thing about this is in your in your JAMstack static site, since this is a React site, you can support the block styles for Gutenberg editor. So if you have Gutenberg blocks in your content, those styles you can then register outside. Now, when you start getting to third-party block libraries, it gets a little tricky. You'll have to make sure that the styles that come with those block plugins are included in your Gatsby app site, which you can do. There's different, there's a Gatsby config file that says, these are the scripts that I want, the styles that I want. So there are a lot of ways to do that, but it gets a little tricky. And then, and then the deployment. So you then push your site, or you figure out, okay, when I build my site, how do I want this to deploy? So again, there's kind of two approaches you can go on. One is kind of the sunny side on the left here, where everything is, built for you. You're using a starter site. This is even the question of, do I want to stay on WordPress, or do I want to do the JAMstack, knowing there's a lot of, it's going to be a learning curve. There's going to be a lot of stuff. So this is kind of the choice you make. Should I migrate my site? Probably not if it's working, unless if you think some of the benefits will be there, some of the performance and security and scalability benefits, then maybe. If it's a very customized site, or there's a lot of interactivity, then probably not, at least not yet. E-commerce site, you might want to wait a little bit. Is it a content-driven blog? Sure. That's a good time where maybe you want to go down the JAMstack route and try it. Is it a new site? Is it something completely new? That's a great time. Play around with it. Most importantly, you can learn something new. You can learn how to how to make this work. There's the bottom line with the moving to a JAMstack site from WordPress is there's the easy way, there's the hosted way, where you have to do nothing, to the straight, I'm building the app completely by hand and doing everything myself. And then there's a lot of room in the middle to play around with. So you just kind of got to look at the situation and say which is going to be right. But I would highly suggest playing around with it, learning it. I truly believe this is the way things are going to go. It has so many benefits. It's such an improvement over kind of some of the current ways of doing things. It's going to ultimately be better for your website visitors as well, performance-wise, security-wise, availability. It's not just how great it's going to be for you. There is a lot of challenges. There are going to be a lot of roadblocks. There is a learning curve, but you don't have to go all the way to the static Gatsby site using a headless CMS. You can leverage a lot of what WordPress has to offer, and then still get the benefits of Gatsby on top of that. So these slides will be available. I'll make these available. These are some good learning points. Just to wrap up the presentation part, again, now I'm Mike Hale. I've been doing this for a while. I'm going to switch over here and show you some of the code that we have. Hang on, let me just Okay, is this showing the GraphQL piece? Yes. I see nods. Okay, perfect. So this is, if you look in my, and I hope this is big enough, I couldn't really get into it. This is the GraphQL plugin. What it basically gives you is this GraphQL playground and some settings. The settings in here, they don't really have to worry about too much, but this is my GraphQL query. So I'm going to say, give me all the posts. I want the date, the link, the excerpt, and the link of the featured image. And then when I run that, these are my results. So this is that GraphQL playground that you can play around with. And then if I wanted this to be the actual query on my site, I can pull it from there. And then let me just zoom in a little bit more so I can show you this section. This is all of the queries that are going to be available to you. You're pretty much going to be using posts mostly. And then I can say where, this is a query, so where published. And it does this edges and node piece, which is, it's a GraphQL thing. It took me a while to get my head wrapped around. But basically, when I say post, the edges is the list of them, and the node is the actual one. And then these are the fields that are available. And all this is coming from that WP GraphQL plugin. It's basically doing that translation of here's WordPress data to GraphQL so that it can be pulled in. So the other thing, if you wanted to even just play around with this and learn GraphQL, you can install the WP GraphQL plugin and not have to worry about, not have the front end side of it. Just go in and kind of learn how GraphQL works with WordPress data. You can install this, and what it will just do is give you it'll be your URL / GraphQL will be the endpoint for that, which is the other nice thing about GraphQL versus REST, is I mentioned before with a REST API, and I've worked with a ton of REST APIs, you'll have /posts, /users, /categories, /tags, and then all the different variations of that. The GraphQL gives you basically one endpoint, the GraphQL endpoint, and then your query decides which ones you want. So I have this post query. I might have one of just categories or pages, and then I specify which fields that I want. So if I want to have this slug on this as well, I can run it. And then you see my slug is in there as well. So if I don't need, I might just want to have a list of posts. I don't want this excerpt. I don't have to query it. So I'm only pulling the actual specific data that I need. Whereas with a REST API, there's really not a way to do that. If I say, give me post data, it's going to just return a post object with everything. Yes, you can play around with having different options or different fields and things, but that really doesn't, it's really not flexible in that way, whereas this one is. So that's the GraphQL playground to play around with. I would suggest, like I said, putting that on, just looking at it, just seeing kind of how that works. It takes a while to kind of wrap your head around GraphQL if you're used to doing SQL statements or anything like that, but it is extremely powerful, extremely flexible. GraphQL, just as static sites are kind of the future of the web, GraphQL, it's not necessarily a full-on replacement for REST APIs, but it's definitely trending that way. It's just a lot more powerful and a lot more flexible, and I think you're going to start to see GraphQL queries or GraphQL APIs replacing REST APIs. I know personally, if I'm building an app, I tend to do a GraphQL API. All right, and then the final thing I want to show you is just some of the GraphQL, or sorry, some of the Gatsby pages. So the way this basically works is you'll have a source that has your templates, and your template file is going to make that GraphQL query and then loop through and display it. The only thing that Gatsby really gives you, or the main file that you need, is this Gatsby config. So here is where I'm saying, when I did this and I installed this Gatsby source WordPress experimental, that's the starter that I used. I had to set this option here of this. So that starter that I used had this built in. But if I was doing this by hand, I would have to install this module, and then in my config file, make sure I put this in. You can copy and paste these. Almost all of the plugins will have a how-to or tutorial or getting started one. And then I just replace it with my development site here. and then that in the config is really all I need to do. And there's a lot of different things that you can do, like this transformer sharp. This is for images. There's different caching. It'll give you a lot of different things. The Gatsby plugins are similar to the WordPress plugins. You'll install it like using npm or yarn, and then you have to add them to this configuration piece. The only thing is, remember, this is where I say you need some technical skills. You need to be comfortable with doing that a little bit, in that, these config files will have to be, you have to edit these manually. There are not really UIs that will do this for you. So as long as you're comfortable with this level of technical copying and pasting, you should be okay. The other piece that Gatsby, when you're doing a static site, is this Gatsby node file. And this is that create pages API that I mentioned before. So I write this file. This is where it's going to say, okay, go get all of my data. So all content nodes. And this is some pieces, create page component. This is telling me that the template that I want to use, create page. This is going to loop through all of so basically what this is saying, so for all of my nodes, my posts, I'm going to loop through this and add that to this template, add to this path, and then it's going to automatically do that to create all the pages for me. And then what you'll see is in your static site, you have all these different pages that are built manually for you. Now, I don't have anything in here that does, the slugs, sorry, they have them in this part. So these are all the actual posts that it comes up with. It's got the page data. So, you're not really going to be that concerned with it. This is configurable. You can do things that will, use the right slugs, for SEO benefits and that. So there's a lot of configurability to it, but it gives you a lot out of the box. Oh, and then actually there's one more thing I want to show you, is the actual site that this builds. Oops. Oh, let me do this. It's not running. So once I have everything built, I'm going to say, or once I have everything configured, I'm going to say Gatsby develop. And that's the develop side. Part of that Gatsby command line is you can have Gatsby, build, develop. Develop is the one it's going to add when you're doing a React app. It gives you a lot of stuff that's just on the development side. So a lot of debugging and things. I would walk through setting up a site from scratch, but it takes a while for everything to download and run. When you do that Gatsby new, it's going to install a lot of the required files and everything, and that can take a while. Get up, have a cup of coffee. It can take anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes sometimes, depending on how you're doing it. And also, I wasn't going to risk on a live talk of doing the trying to get something up and running where it's requiring third party. So this is the build process that Gatsby's doing, and it does take it a little while because with WordPress it has to query everything, build all the files. It'll be done in a minute, and then I'll show you the actual web page. Oh, I think it actually built. Oh, it's already done. One thing I will point out is sometimes when you do this, you'll see some weird errors in here. Like this is telling me, and this is coming from the starter code, that this media remote file is deprecated, it's been made, media item local file. Okay, so it's going to spit out some warnings. Sometimes I have to fix that. That's one of those things where I said things change a lot as you go. And since this is dev, it's going to just give me a local built-in web server, a node server that I can then view my site. So when I'm doing development locally, I don't have to worry about going to a whole other website. Now let me just pull this over into that window. So now this is just the starter. Obviously, my site is not optimized for the Gatsby theme. This is just a site that my wife and I have. And you'll notice one thing here is this short code doesn't get, it didn't get pulled over. And I'm not sure if that's because I have this plugin disabled or because it's not doing that in when it brings it over. I have to check, but you'll see some weird stuff. And if I want to view all posts, this starter is now giving me a list of my blog posts. I haven't done anything. This is all right in there. And then I can click on this. And you can see title, I've got a recipe plugin. But now you'll notice like this is just not, it's not pretty. And it doesn't have a lot of the formatting. So that's kind of one of the issues is like it doesn't have the theme styles. So all of this is obviously if you go to the main site, that's not there. It's it looks like you would expect a blog post to look. I don't have this style. This is just the out of the box, straight up starter theme. And I left it like this because I wanted to show you that you'll have to do some stuff on the starter. You'll have to make sure that you get some styling in there. You'll have to, have things like that we're like, this is a plugin. I say jump to recipe, but you'll notice there's no recipe. This is because this is a WordPress plugin that on the WordPress site works. So it partially works in that it puts these two buttons on the page, but it doesn't actually display the recipe. Again, left it in there. This is one of the roadblocks. It's like, okay, well, that doesn't work. Maybe that recipe doesn't get included in the content. What am I going to have to do? You're going to find things as you migrate over that don't necessarily, go as smoothly as you want. I had a heck of a time when I was trying to set up the demo. I was doing it the old way, and I had mismatched the version of things where my Gatsby version was different than my, one of the starter plugins. So there's going to be some frustrations. Again, this is a great starting point because now from this, I can go in here and I can go into my post template and I can change this around. I can change this to look, to look differently from my content. I can add this template file and then that will clean up all of that. But as you can see, hopefully, as you can see, it's kind of a good place to start. There is a lot of that plumbing that I didn't have to do. I just had to run, 3 command lines, and I got this, which is, not great, obviously, but it's a good place to start. And now I can go through and I can touch this up. I can figure out why my recipe is not showing up. I can figure out why that short code is not showing up. So it's not just a push a button and you're done, but it is it is definitely better than the starting with nothing. So with that, that's the presentation. If there are questions, I wasn't able to watch the chat, but Miranda, if there are questions, I can look back through, or if anybody wants me to show something specifically again, I would be happy to. I'm going to keep my screen up just to be safe.
Yeah, there were a few questions that popped up in the chat, and I'll start with asking one that was asked at the beginning, and then we can allow other users to ask their questions too if they have them. Are there certain design tools that work for front end and UI purposes that work really well for CMS that you recommend, or particularly better with the JAMstack setup?
Yeah, that's a good question. The nice part about JAMstack is it's just straight up HTML. So you can use like Bootstraps or Alma or Tailwind, any of the kind of the CSS frameworks that are out there for your sites, because it is treated basically as with Gatsby and the way I do it, it's a React app. If you're more familiar with Vue, you can do it like that. So you're creating basically template files and components that have styling on them. The themes you don't necessarily get like you would with WordPress. So you have to make sure that if you're creating a template from scratch, that you're doing things right as far as like accessibility and technical SEO piece and that. But it will support Bootstrap, all of the different CSS frameworks and that. As far as like what tools you use to design, it would be the same thing. Whatever works, for designing your WordPress UIs would work with that. But it's basically the same. But you are going to be doing probably a little bit more from scratch until there's a bit more of an advanced Gatsby theme marketplace out there. And there are some, I think it's Gatsby WP themes. Just do a search Gatsby WP themes and it'll come up. But there are some that are kind of out there now to start it.
Thank you. I do have a few more, but if
Sure.
anyone else has a question, they feel free to jump in. If not, I'll ask my other question. All right. Well, the other question was, would you be able to highlight maybe a well-known app or website that is currently using JAMstack?
Yeah, there's a lot. I believe on the Gatsby site they have a showcase page somewhere. I could look it up. But the example I use is Smashing Magazine, which is a UI UX blog. They're ton of content, very popular site. They've switched over. They switched over a while back, and they have a great blog post. And it might actually be in my. It's not in my list. I thought it was in my list, but they've moved over and they had a good case study of how, kind of how they did it, the reasoning behind it, some of the stuff that they found, and I believe that's still in effect. But yeah, I don't have the link offhand, but even if you just search Smashing Magazine, WordPress static migration, you'll find it. Yeah. That's probably the biggest one that I know of that moved over. And then I know on I believe on GatsbyJS.com, I believe they have a showcase site, an example site of someone that's done it.
All right, then I have one more.
Sure.
And my last question is, you mentioned that it can sometimes be a little trickier to integrate third-party block editors with this setup. Would ACF be considered one of those more trickier integrations?
Yeah, you can use definitely. You can use the ACF piece with it. The tricky part, I mean, is when you register a block editor is more on the styles. If it's in the content, you're okay. It's creating the content. It will put out the content the way you need. It's kind of around the styling. So if I'm using a block editor that has its own style, some of them have like a master style sheet I found, and some of them have a style sheet per block. What you kind of have to do is extract it from the admin side and make sure that it's in your front end app as well, and then register that style. And as long as things are coming out with that, with those class names and everything, it will apply there as well. I've used Atomic Blocks, which is now Genesis Blocks, and I think it's Cadence and Ultimate Blocks add-on, I think. And I've played around a little bit with those. Those are a little more straightforward as far as their styling goes, but there is a step that you kind of have to take to get their styles to apply on the static site. And it's really just making sure that you can get their CSS onto your static site, and making sure that the class names and everything are the same. It's a little bit of a manual step, but it's not too hard. But I know some of the Blocks plugins, the way they structure their CSS can be a little tricky.
Okay, thank you.
Like sometimes they can have it right within like their components and stuff. So yeah.
And then Marina had a question about do you think it would be a good recommendation for to learn JAMstack so that someone newer or anyone in development could put that on their resume?
Definitely. I think that's a great thing. I believe personally, my belief is that this approach is going to become very popular. It is kind of a JavaScript based thing. Gatsby uses a lot of React. I think it's Nuxt. If you're familiar with Vue, I think Nuxt is Nuxt or Next. I think Nuxt is the one that is kind of Gatsby for Vue. 11D is kind of agnostic. There's a bunch of different ones. So any of those tools that you can use, definitely. I think if you just look at like how big React is growing, how big JavaScript is growing, if you kind of think of JAMstack as falling under that JavaScript umbrella of development, then absolutely. I think as you start getting to these sites, this model, and we're seeing, this is still maybe just kind of the second round of where it just kind of became a cool way of doing something to build a site. Like, the GitHub pages used to do this, to now actual, production business websites moving to this, brought up a whole new set of problems, obviously like with size and time and scale, and those problems being addressed. And now we're just kind of see the next things like, okay, now what's the next roadblock? Okay, and now there's companies getting over, those funding numbers I think are important. because that shows that the money people, the VC people believe in this, and they see it as an alternative. I'm going to steal this from my friend Zach Gordon, who I go to a lot for a lot of this stuff. Is he said if 30% of the web is run on WordPress, then 30% of WordPress could be run with JAMstack. And if you just look at that the growth of it, I think it would be definitely a great skill set to have. And it's kind of a nice hybrid because the WordPress admin side, you know the WordPress side, but you also know the JAMstack side. As far as what, is it more beneficial to do just JAMstack? Maybe, maybe not. It depends on how you go. I know there's some agencies now that are starting to do that. I actually, before I took a full-time job, was looking at making my agency specialize in migrating WordPress sites to JAMstack sites. Similar to some of the hosted solutions, but more customizations involved. It's definitely a skill set that knowing JavaScript, knowing React, knowing a static site generator, and a type of headless CMS stuff is definitely going to be a skill set, I think, in the near term future that's going to be very handy. Because the other thing too is you're going to learn a lot. Like if you learned React to build Gutenberg blocks, you learned a lot of JavaScript and React in that. It's going to apply to other things as well. If you can do a Gatsby site in React, you're going to have a good handle on React, so that maybe then you can leverage that to building a Gutenberg block, which is built off of a layer of React. So there are some skills that will handle or cross over to a lot of different things.
Can I ask some questions?
Yes, please.
Okay. So just so you know where I'm coming from, Mike, I'm a software developer, been writing code for mostly embedded processing, embedded systems for 30 years or more. I have built a few websites, nothing major, mostly using WordPress. And so I guess some of the initial questions I have are just clarification questions. JAMstack itself is just a way to build things, right? It's not an application or something you can download and install, right?
Absolutely, yeah. JAMstack, just think of the jam part. I'm not necessarily a big fan of that term, but Netlify, who's like one of the leaders in it, that's the term they use, and that's what's caught on. If you just think about it, that jam part, all it means is JavaScript API markup. So,
right. So I'm just clarifying it for myself. It's not something I can download. It's a way of building things using this. Okay.
Yeah, it's a model, and then for each of those levels, like the JavaScript side, it could be a React app, it could be Vue app, it could be Gatsby, whatever,
right.
That's the JavaScript, and as long as you have an API with a markup that pulls that data in and spits the site out, it's really just kind of a framework, right?
So like for Marina to say, oh, I know, I put JAMstack on my resume, that really means I know a method of building things, but it's not like I learned React or I learned blah, blah. It doesn't say the specific things that you use to build things in a JAMstack methodology, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I talked about the headless CMSs too, exactly. That's one where, you're going to be using, you have choices.
Right.
You have choices on all of those different layers of how to do it.
Okay. Yeah. Now, the next question I have is, I'm not sure, I had to step out for a couple of minutes, but did you say in particular why WordPress would be a good headless CMS to use? I know it can be used, but is there a reason to use it when there's all these other things that you could use that are more, more modern or, anyhow?
Yeah. And I think that's the question is one of the biggest reasons is that editorial workflow. If you have writers and editors, and maybe on the admin side, you have different checklists of things that you want for posts to go, you can manage the access and that's one where you're going to have WordPress. If you probably have all of your content in a WordPress site now, everybody has a WordPress site. So leveraging kind of what you already have. If it's something where you're managing a lot of, updated content, not just blog posts, but maybe you have, a custom post type of something that you need to publish, it gives you a good way, a good admin way to manage that. Even, I'll use WooCommerce for an example, like, product pages. or if you have an event and you have you're adding your speakers and you want to be able to upload an image and to do that, there's a lot of existing ways to manage that content on the backend. The nice thing about WordPress as the headless CMS is that whole admin area. Everything that gives you. Some of the headless CMSs, well, that could be a good or a bad thing, yeah.
So it's headless, but you're still using the WordPress admin portion. So it's not quite headless, right?
Right. Well, and that's where headless is.
So you're saying headless in terms of a user who's accessing the website. But in terms of managing the website, you're still using the WordPress head, if you will, to manage it, right?
Yeah, the headless.
That makes so much more sense to me. Okay.
Yeah, not the front end side. And those headless CMSs that I mentioned before, some of them are strictly API driven, like you just configured. Some of them have you can fill out the form. They all do things a little differently. Sanity is nice. You configure the content type and the fields, and then it gives you a form, and you can fill out the form. That's what. I should clarify that the headless piece is there's no front end that the users are going to do. There's the admin piece of it.
Well, people are using headless CMSs already. They may know that. I didn't know that, so that's helpful for me. Yeah.
Yeah. There's terms. There's some people refer to JAMstack as headless, and it's well, that's just one part of it. So yeah, that's one of the problems with this is there's a lot of terms are used a bit interchangeably, or they don't quite know. Like decoupled and headless is basically the same thing.
Mm-hmm. So basically you're talking about, in terms of, like a JAMstack kind of thing, you're talking about creating a mostly static set of pages, right? It's not dynamic, but you can use a little bit of JavaScript to make them a little bit dynamic. Is that right?
Yeah.
But it's really not running on the server. It's really running in your web browser.
Exactly.
At least the dynamic part. It's going to go out to some other server maybe to get a recipe or a time or a date or whatever, I guess, maybe.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's kind of that hybrid model. So if you just have straight up content and nothing changes, it could be all static. But anytime you have like a form, like a contact form or comments, or you want to pull in data from something, your static site will have script on it that's dynamic and will pull. So it's kind of a misnomer when you say static sites and you think everything on that page is there. No, you can still have dynamic data coming in. You still, because all that's going to be is on your static site is there's this JavaScript there that's going to call an API, get the data, and then present it on the page.
Right.
So it's like, latest news, everything on your site could be static, but that latest news could be pulled from somewhere. So that's kind of that hybrid model. So it doesn't have to be all static. But
so it can be static, but it doesn't have to be.
Exactly. Yeah,
okay.
Exactly.
Thanks. That's all the questions I have.
Cool.
I appreciate it, by the way. Thank you.
Oh, sure. Hope it helped. And I covered a lot of ground because there's a lot to cover, but hopefully I just wanted to give people enough where they can kind of look at it and get an idea of what's possible and maybe some steps to start playing around with it.
Right.
Yeah, no, it was really, really interesting. I appreciate you explaining all that. I mean, in the beginning, I was a little bit like, wait a minute, can we go back to basics here? But now it all kind of makes sense. And I was telling Miranda that I am going to be sharing it with my classmates in my coding boot. And because we're just learning Ruby on Rails and how all, the back end talks to the front end and all that. So this is like super interesting. And I just want to thank you very much.
Yeah, glad to help. Yeah, and I'm at Mike Hale on Twitter. So if you think of something later, anybody if you want to follow up, just hit me up. Be happy to clarify anything.
Great, thanks. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mike, if it's okay with you, I will put your Twitter handle on the Meetup page. And
sounds good.
when you're signed up, we'll get notified and I'll have a way to reach out to you.
Perfect. And I'll send you a link with the updated slides as well.
Thank you very much. Any other questions before we bring this to an end? Okay, well, if you decide you have questions later, you can go to the Meetup page and ask them there, or reach out to Mike directly. And thank you all again for spending your Saturday with us, and we really appreciate it.
All right, thanks. Thanks, everyone.